United States gets out of crises by building houses and filling them with things. They had so many houses and so many things going on and get a crisis. So you have a major crisis in 2007 to 2008. How did the world get out of that major crisis in 2007, 2008? Thank you, Michael. As always, incredibly stimulating and interesting. The other point is there's this concept of the new feudalism. I think it poses an interesting challenge. When Braudel was writing about the nature of the feudal economies, he said it's a bit like a large house. And he says in the basement, people are getting on with their everyday lives. They're growing things, they're eating things, they're reproducing. And there's a world of social reproduction, if you like, going on. And superimposed on that, certain market interaction. This is the world of the market, and it's a sort of an egalitarian structure of market exchange with the equivalence of values being exchanged. So that's the second layer in the house. And the top, in the attic, he said, are the capitalists. And what they do is they exchange things and do crazy things, totally irrelevant to social reproduction. And it's largely irrelevant in relationship to the market. I'm wondering about that model. And it comes up in the following kind of thing. Is all of this stuff that is going on in the financial sector parasitic? Is it them playing in the attic and they're making money? The Federal Reserve makes money and they go play casino games on the stock market and all the rest of it and play around with asset values and art market and all that kind of thing. In other words, is it a world unto itself, and is it parasitic? There's a tendency, somehow or other, there is a real economy, and then there's a fantasy economy. And the fantasy economy is in the attic, as it were, and the real economy is on the ground, and therefore what's the relationship between the two? So I want to play a little bit with that. In the Grundrisse, Marx talks about the totality, capital as a totality. And the totality is comprised of many different circulatory systems. The circulation of capacity to labor, the circulation of commodities, the circulation of money, the circulation of capital, of course. And at some point, Marx kind of said, I need to look at the circulation of fixed capital as a particular sort of category. In setting up this model of the totality, which is made up of these different circulatory systems, Marx is in fact setting up a kind of an ecosystemic, biological, organic model of how capital works. The human body has different circulatory systems within it. My heart is pushing the blood around. I'm getting oxygen via my lungs, and I'm ingesting food, and that's going into my stomach, and the neural system is. So in the same way that a human body is susceptible to any damage to any one of those circulatory systems, so when Marx sets up different circulatory systems, in effect, he's going to say that the whole thing can collapse if any one of them collapses, because they're all integral to each other. So this gets me past this idea that there's only one cause of crisis. In fact, Marx is saying there are different circulatory systems. Any one of them fails, you're in a mess. And so that it's terribly important for us, I think, to understand what the relationships are between the different circulatory systems, and in what ways, if one breaks down, does it actually mean the whole thing goes kaput? I mean, and this is important because it involves diagnostics. I mean, if you went to a hospital and had stomach pain and somebody said, oh, it's really a heart problem, and they gave you a sort of all stuff for your heart, and you went home again afterwards, well, you die of your stomach cancer, you know. And I feel a lot of that goes on in Marxist circles when they start talking about crisis formation. You say it's crisis formation, and they say basically, oh, it's the heart, i.e. the falling rate of profit. And that's the only thing that really matters. Marx's model is, I think, very interesting to think of that way. And this is going to lead, I think, into the question I really want to pose with you, which is what is the role of the circulation of interest-bearing capital and credit in relationship to all these other circulatory systems? Is it parasitic, or does it play a very important function? And Marx says it plays a very important function, and we have to look at that function in order to explain something. And what is interesting to me is a lot of people talk about the rise of financialization after 1980 or so, and everybody talks about it. But there's an interesting question of why. Why did it happen? The circulatory systems are integrating with each other, and somehow or other, one went from being, subordinate to being boss. I think that's your argument in simple terms. Marx was trying to come up with a theoretical reason why something like that might happen. I mean, he's writing in 1857, but he's providing us, I think, with some very good ways of thinking about this kind of question of why financialization took the form it did and what the consequences have been of that financialization. Marx argues, he starts off by kind of saying, there's a problem in the circulation of capital. Capital is circulating, but it has different turnover time. If I'm planting a vineyard, I have to think of a time horizon of 15 years or something of that kind. If I'm just growing wheat, I'm on an annual cycle. So there's different turnover times. And there's problems arising because when capital gets locked up in a long turnover time, it's dead capital. It's devalued capital. And so the different turnover times raise all sorts of issues about coordination of financial flow. In cotton making, for example, the cotton factory wants a certain amount of cotton every day. It's a continuous process. But when the cotton harvest comes in only once a year, as was the case in Marx's time, because it was the cotton harvest in the United States, which was crucial, then there's a real inventory problem. Who keeps the cotton all the year round? And what happens to the financial flows? At that point, he kind of says the financial flows get evened out and you get helped out, covering differential turnover times by use of credit. That's the only way in which you can take these disparities in production and circulation times and homogenize them so that the financial flows keep going on a continuous kind of basis, so that the merchant who's controlling the cotton, if you like, in inventory and so on, and has all the bales stored somewhere or other, will release them on a daily basis to the cotton factories, that kind of model. And at this point, you need something like a credit system to be able to smooth all that out and make sure that the whole thing works. So there is something about a credit system that is not parasitic in this case. It is in fact helping smooth out differential turnover times. And that's the first part that Marx makes when he's talking about the fixation of capital through differential turnover times, which has to be released by way of setting up a credit system. So this is a function of the credit system, which is absolutely crucial for the foundation of a capitalist economy. That's the first step. The second step is this, that Marx kind of says, look, it's very important that we acknowledge the rising productivity of labor. And one of the ways in which, of course, you increase the productivity of labor is by the employment of machines. And so he starts to analyze the whole kind of question, and you were talking about industrial capitalism, that in industrial capitalism, you're going to employ machines which have a lifetime of maybe 15, 20 years or whatever. And the big question arises, how is the value of the machine incorporated in the product, and how is it paid for, and what is the monetary and financial flow that goes along with it? And it turns out that Marx then kind of says, well, there's a difficulty here, because if you're going to engage in fixed capital formation as an entrepreneur, it means you're going to have to lock up capital for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. And how are you going to do that? And that is a problem. In order to do that, you have to withdraw from contemporary circulating capital and consumption. So you have this initial point where the investment in machines is to the detriment of contemporary consumption. You need, he says, surplus capital and surplus labor in order to create the machines which allow you to then increase the productivity of that labor. So the surpluses of capital and labor are absolutely foundational. And how do you get them? Well, there's a whole history of people like Rostow way back saying, well, you have to squeeze contemporary consumption. You have to save like crazy in order to have the money to invest in the machines, which then will actually give you a payoff down the way. Now, the interesting thing here is when you invest in machines and you increase the productivity of labor, what you do is you actually produce surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor because you're unemploying labor through machine production. You start to use machines to increase the productivity of labor And in so doing, you produce the conditions which make the employment of more machines even more possible. So there's a closed loop. And then Marx looks at this and says, well, this is a kind of a real problem. In other words, capital at some point or other is going to generate surpluses which have to be absorbed. Now, there are two major theories within the Marxist where crises come from. If you belong to the Sweezy line, you would say the big problem is the absorption of the surpluses. That's where the problem lies. The capital can't absorb the surpluses. It's a theory of overaccumulation. The other is the falling rate of profit argument, which tends to be a bit dominant in Marxist circles right now. But Marx says you get both of them going on at the same time. You're going to get a falling rate of profit and a rising mass. And in fact, Marx says right at the very beginning that every individual capitalist will want to decrease the value of the labor power they employ by technological change. At the same time, as the profit rate falls, they're not going to respond to a falling rate of profit by producing less. They're going to respond to a falling rate of profit by producing more. In other words, and you'll appreciate this as given your economic background, capital does not tend to lead to equilibrium of supply and demand. It operates on the basis of backward bending supply curves, as we call them. The backward bending supply curve is the one like it happened in oil. An oil state will have a certain revenue target for how much it needs. If the oil price goes down, they'll produce more oil. The price goes down even further. And this is what a backward bending supply curve is about. In other words, Marx's model of a bourgeois economy is one which is founded on backward bending supply curves, which means it never goes towards equilibrium. And all those nutty people who started to think about efficient market hypotheses, everything going to equilibrium, they're out of their minds because that's not the way the capital works. Capital works with backward bending supply curves, and what that generates is increasing disequilibria. And it can be either monotonic divergence from equilibrium, or it's going to be oscillatory, increasingly, oscillating things like this. So at some point, it comes up with a very intriguing answer. He says a lot of this is going to be addressed by developing forms of investment in fixed capital and consumption fund formation that do not affect the productivity of labor. And the consumption fund, biggest item obviously would be housing. And another item would be automobiles and so on. And it turns out that there are two big sinks for surplus capital. That is, where can you dump your surplus capital? Marx mentions one of them. He says, military expenditures. He says, spending on military and all of that, it's just you might take a whole wad of value and tip it in the ocean. It's a wonderful kind of image. That, in effect, is what you do. You deal with the surplus you've got by tipping it in the ocean. The other is to engage in insane, stupid urbanization product, like that development in New York City that has your name on it, which is called Hudson Yards, which is the most insane, redundant form of urbanization you can imagine to. It doesn't meet anybody's needs whatsoever. It's just completely egregious. But it's not only Hudson Yards. You've got plenty of that going on in Shanghai. Look at the urbanization of the Gulf states. It's all disposing of surplus capital.
城市是什么呢？城市在现代经济阶段，就是一个资本与风险同步集中的过程。
But here comes the kicker in the thing. At a certain point, Marx kind of says, this will not happen unless you integrate the circulation of fixed capital in this way into the circulation of interest-bearing capital. And he actually makes a very interesting kind of comment. He says, historically, of course, it's been state finance and all the rest of it that has often led to this kind of formation of what I would call a kind of state finance nexus, which is like the Bank of England and all that kind of stuff. And therefore, it's all about national debt and all the rest of it. And Marx kind of says interest-bearing capital, which is absolutely necessary for fixed capital formation. In other words, you cannot have fixed capital formation without having an adequate credit system. And that then leads to, if you like, this kind of connectivity between these two circulation processes, the circulation of fixed capital and the circulation of interest-bearing capital. Now, this takes us back to around 1980, when there's a lot of problems in the economy. The surpluses that were being generated couldn't find a place to go very, very easily. And therefore, there was a call upon liberating interest-bearing capital. And that liberation of interest-bearing capital was necessary for fixed capital to be able to play this role, kind of absorbing surpluses in ways which didn't sort of create extra problems down the way. And that then, of course, once you liberated interest-bearing capital to do that, you get what exactly you're talking about, which is a class formation. Now, it's interesting, in the Grundrisse, Marx kind of says this is going to create a class formation, which is a class of financiers and bankers and all the rest of it. So class formation sets up. And I think you're dead right to talk about the formation of that class since the 1980s and the existence of it as oligarchical and all the rest of it. I think that's right. But my point is to say, you got to understand a bit about where that's coming from and how the demand for that liberation came up and what that role has been in his colleagues. But you get insane urbanization, a bit like Hudson Yards and all the rest of it. But that rescued global capitalism. The world got out of crisis in 2008, 2009 by China taking up the lead and saying, okay, we can actually generate huge amounts of demand globally and all the rest of it by a massive urbanization infrastructure project, building 20,000 miles of high-speed rail and all the rest of it. I mean, all those kinds of things. A fantastic job. But that required certain things to happen in the financial system. Now, I just launched this out and see what my Chinese colleagues say about it and what you might say about it. But if you launch into massive urbanization of that style, I learned from my study of Second Empire Paris, when Haussmann rebuilt the city, was that he needed new financial institutions to do it. He couldn't do it without a radical opening up of the credit immobilier and the credit mobilier. In other words, these financial institutions were critical to the urbanization of Paris. Now, how has the consumption fund been financed in China? Well, you start to introduce mortgage finance and you develop a financial system, which during the 1990s and 2000s. Now, I don't think of this as saying China all along wanted to have a financial system like the one they have that exists in the West. But if you go into urbanization in the form that you go into it, you've got to come up with some credit structures which are able to create it and absorb it. And then the interesting question is which one of those credit structures is going to be productive and which ones are going to be insane and all the rest of it. And I will note that the banks in China that hardly existed in 1980, the four largest banks in the world by assets right now, by far, are Chinese. I think you're right to point to this. The potentiality in China to manage this system and this situation is really significantly there. And I think that some of the things we've seen of trying to prevent oligarchical formation and so on are very, very significant. But it's not clear to me that this is clearly recognized in the Chinese situation, that this is where things are at. And I think maybe what you're trying to do, and I'm backing you on this, is to say, look, you've got the possibility in China to go a different path, to ones which lead you straight into Wall Street. But there's a danger. There's a real danger that you'll slide into Wall Street. And I noticed, by the way, that you've invited in JP Morgan and all those people to start messing around in your economy. I really worry about all of that. So we're at that situation. So that's my comment and contribution. I think what you're doing is fantastic. I'm just going to sort of lock it back into my reading of the Grundrisse, just to sort of give it a little bit more background to what you're saying and what you're doing. But you may have some kind of interesting kind of comments, I think.